Good evening, everybody. We are honored to welcome you in the Center of Urban History. Today we are going to present a lecture. This will be the beginning of the series of lectures, and that would be the accompanying program dedicated to the exhibition about global and individual experience of the war. This is very various program, a verified program, so it includes lectures, excursions, and different events for children. There is information on our website, and we are going to publish programs soon. With this lecture, we would like to cover a number of issues and things we would like to discuss that are related to the history of the First World War. And we would like to express our gratitude to our dear presenter, is the representative of University of Northern Colorado, Mr. Stephen Seegel. The lecture is called Map Wars of Darkness and Color, the Nationalization of Transnational East European Geographers During the Long Great War. Be careful when listening, ask questions, better in Ukrainian of course, but if you speak fluent English, you are welcome.
Алло? Окей. Дуже дякую за запрошення. Please, my lecture will be in English. І українською мовою чи англійською. Прошу запитати. Я розумію. I want to also encourage you to see this wonderful exhibition that the Center of Urban History has put together. As a historian of World War I, I have seen many exhibitions, and this is the best. No, quite seriously, it is really great. It is really great, and you should see it. In the emotional whirlwind of Ukraine after Maidan, amid annexation, war, violence, trauma, surreal Kremlin media, border defense, terror, jingoism, post-genocidal memory, provincial, as I see it, because the US is so provincial, neo-imperial and neo-national culture wars, corruption, inequality, illusions about Europe and in Europe, geopolitics, and Western deafness and blindness to Ukraine's affairs. The historian's ability to write honestly, objectively, and not too over-selectively about the lived experiences of humans in World War I is severely impaired. Here are clear problems. Which event was most central to the Great War? How important were the 1917 revolutions and Allied involvement in the East? What about the damage done to human beings? What ought to be highlighted? The Battle of Galicia, the West Ukrainian Republic, Skoropadsky or Petvura, the Polish-Ukrainian War, pogroms, red takeovers of Kiev, unfinished Habsburg federalist projects, and nostalgia. Where does the history of empire, the USSR, Poland's conquests of Lviv and Vilnius fit in comfortable multi-kulti history? What about subtle changes in gender roles? Which Ukrainian government of the revolutionary period ought to be praised or vilified? Must every question, say, about 1914 to 1923, be ethnocentric, one that starts and ends with us, or you, and them? Sometimes the critical Western-looking gaze the nation and state builder must admit, these answers are few. The Great War isn't over. There's work to be done, and so much to lose. Ungendered and colored maps. Insofar as Europe's states and nations make it their political task to revise and defend turfs, territories, with monopolies on violence and bold, dark lines, one has to step back and look at the classic causes of World War I and the maps of World War I. These are the roles of Europe's great powers after Vienna. Revolutions in 1848, the political and economic formations of a late 19th century alliance system. There were Balkan and colonial wars on the high seas and in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. The great isms of capitalism, imperialism, terrorism, paramilitary violence. Last but not least, in and beyond the trenches, as described by Wilfred Owen, for example, and Siegfried Sassoon, there are technologies of chemical warfare, air power, and maps, and the militarism that led to violence in the first place. It's therefore hard to select and tell stories of this total war. But in gathering up our sources, our gerela, we have to try. Millions of students, at least the ones who read, can recite the proximate cause of World War I. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, was assassinated by Gavrilo Princip in Sarajevo. After that, depending on your language, status, and place, civilization began to unravel. Neutrality proved tough, and new opportunities arose. Take the issues of Europe's post-1918 and post-1945, post-war memory. The persistence of Polish and Ukrainian God and fatherland narratives for the reestablishment of statehood, or reconciliation efforts in the early decades of West European integration, historic Franco-German rapprochement, the fragile post-war consensus that Tony Judd writes about on the continent in the 1950s. This consensus was that militaristic nationalism in Europe represented the 20th century's greatest scourge, its greatest problem. So let's now look more carefully at maps of Ukraine, as in Russia, because these maps sometimes follow their own logic. And in Ukraine, I would argue ethno-nationalism of a civic kind poses a real problem. Ethnocentric cults, for example, Bandera, exist here and are still colored in favorably. Conventional West European endposts, results, and effects of the Great War sometimes do not work, or might seem too politically correct. For the history of the lives of transnational geographers, the years 1917, 18, 19 work badly for a Ukrainian master narrative. Europeans looking at maps, claiming to have surpassed barbaric nationalism, refer back awkwardly to 1918 and to the collapse of German, Habsburg, Russian in 1917, and Ottoman in 1923 empires, while unwittingly continuing these projects in imperial and national form in EU land. And here, I should say, I respect Ukraine's territorial sovereignty by virtue of its independence in 1991 and the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. Beyond Europe's alliance system, with all due further local respect to individual human beings, people whose families lived and died in struggles in Ukraine from 1914 to 1923, I tend to be skeptical toward those who seek heroic themes, comforting stories of sacrifice, sometimes in a religious way, or national or communist martyrdom for those who died for whatever cause. On the other hand, Americans often forget that 1914 in Ukraine represented a fratricidal war, a war between brothers. 3.5 million mustered into the Imperial Russian Army, around 250,000 into the Austro-Hungarian Army. The tales of heroism and martyrdom become instrumentalized by maps and by eager politicians, but more often they are deeply private stories of tragedy and loss, told in the trust of relationships or after a few drinks. Given the nature of Ukraine's maps and projects of World War I, which failed, and the governments that went into the immigration or underground, and the frustrations that were channeled into the OUN and UPA, one can recall colors: red, white, green, yellow, blue, and also later brown and black uses of violence in the long period from the 19-teens to the 1940s. So not conforming to the West's maps or textbooks exactly, in Ukraine there were multiple colors, and violence was never simple. Nor perhaps are these colors yet overcome, by this I mean brown and black, by orange, blue, and yellow. There was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, for too long ignored. The punitive reparations and clauses against Germany and Austria-Hungary at Paris, all of these things come after this general narrative. The history of local wars, or maybe civil wars, in Ukraine's 11 governments between 1917 and 21. The Polish-Soviet border set at Riga in March 1921. The establishment in December 1922 of the USSR, and not to forget the unmixing, cleansing, and genocide of 20th century populations. These realities in the alliance system and in Europe's unmappable East are not just memory. They are with us today. So now, I think we have to look someplace else. Let me turn to my first Great War individual, Joseph Conrad. He was born in Berdichev, now Ukraine, in 1957, to a Szlachta family of the Korzeniowski crest. He left for England and wrote novels, including Heart of Darkness. To build my post-colonial argument about maps and lives, I will call his book Ukrainian. No, it was not written in Shevchenko's Ukrainian, or Polish or Russian, which he knew, or Yiddish, which he must have heard from childhood in the city, but in the English, his third language, which he had perfected after he left the Russian Empire and East Central Europe for good. Now, when I was a little chap, I had a passion for maps, Conrad wrote in fictional form in 1899 about his past life in Ukraine. I would look for hours at South America or Africa or Australia and lose myself in all the glories of exploration. At that time, there were many blank spaces on the earth, and when I saw one that looked particularly inviting on a map, but they all look like that, I would put my finger on it and say, when I grow up, I will go there. Conrad's mental escapist map, circa 1870, was of Europe's 20th century future. But beyond Europe, dark continents, bloodlands, and so on. His aunt in Poland, Marina Regina Nałęcz-Korzeniowska, fluent in French, made her own maps. And she really did give her nephew an atlas of the world when he was 12. The Korzeniowski men had taken part in and were profoundly affected by the partitions and Polish romantic nationalism in the 19th century. Conrad was both a representative of the West's Orientalism and a critic of Europe's colonial power. He warned of war, conquest, and plunder in the Belgian Congo, another Berdichev, a modern Ukraine. The Congo, like Ukraine, was a colonial object of geopolitical projects in the 20th century. It was a place of death, exploration, and plunder. It was a place where Europe's values also went to die. Now to my transnational geographers, these men who cross borders. When World War I broke out in August 1914, Albrecht Penck, the renowned German geomorphologist, chair, and professor of geography at the University of Berlin, now Humboldt University, and director of the Kaiser's Institute for Oceanography, Meereskunde, was on an international expedition to Australia, sponsored by the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Upon his return to the London docks, Scotland Yard detained and interrogated him. In England, Hank was suspected of, you guessed it, espionage for the Central Powers. While the London press stirred a jingoistic populace, investigators confiscated Hank's notes and books. These materials included his maps of the world, of Africa and of Asia and of Australia, which he never got back. In addition, Hank, who supported German colonial and imperial aims against British sea power, was prevented from going home, Heimatweh, for several months to his family in Berlin. For these individual lives in the Great War, it was just the start. There were other geographers. Throughout 1915, the Polish geographer Eugeniusz Romer, born here, in this very city, I still cannot find monuments or memorials to Romer, I'll explain why, was working on a grand project in Vienna. He debuted in December 1915 in Krakow, at the Old Polish Academy of Learning, before a friendly audience of experts and professors. In spring 1916, it was published as the Geographical Statistical Atlas of Poland. These maps were made in Vienna at the Military Geographical Institute by the firm of Freytag und Berndt. Let's look at the maps. As a Galician Pole who spoke German fluently and had traveled widely in the West, in Switzerland, France, England, and even across the United States, he came to the US on an expedition in 1912. Romer was a very clever człowiek. He made use of a transnational network of Polish benefactors in Vienna, the leniency and perhaps gullibility of Stefan von Habsburg, and his own pre-war friends and colleagues among Allied geographers in the West. He was a scientist. Polish activists sent his atlas via neutral Sweden for fear of confiscation by the Central Powers during the Great War to London, Paris, and Washington. Back to Pank. Pank, after leaving Scotland Yard, managed to get his hands on Romer's maps. He tried in vain to have Romer arrested in 1916. Now, this was all the more meaningful because the two men had known each other for 20 years. This is a lesson for you graduate students. Romer was Pank's former postgraduate student in 1895 in Vienna. So this is what happens when your professors try to arrest you. In 1911, Romer had become the chair of geography here at Lviv University. Pank reasoned that the Viennese police should capture him for treason and that he should be tried by the German military staff. And yet, largely thanks to his connections, Romer was not arrested. Instead, Romer became one of Poland's most important architects of thick, bold borders, guarded by militaries, for the treaties of Versailles in 1919 and Riga in 1921. In the 1920s, he worked in the field of geography education in Poland, in Polish, to develop civil institutions for cartography in the Second Republic. And here you can see from some of the maps the controversies between Germany and Poland, the issue of the Danzig corridor, for example. There are also border conflicts over Silesia and Pomerania. Let's talk about another person. In the United States, across the pond, and from distant Atlantic shores, the most important geographer was Isaiah Bowman, born into poverty in Ontario, Canada. He became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1899, the year of Conrad's Heart of Darkness. In 1915, he became the director of the American Geographical Society, which was founded in 1851, and then in 1918 he was chosen as the chief territorial specialist of the U.S. Committee to Negotiate Peace. I write about this in my book, Mapping Europe's Borderlands. Bowman was placed in charge of men, geographers, scientists, who coordinated all geographical data for the post-war remapping of a brilliant future, a democratic East Central Europe, which according to Wilson's 14 points would be mapped by national self-determination. Now, shortly after World War I, Bowman was fond of recounting his experiences. He was a man who loved to come into contact with important people because he thought he was important himself. He networked among Europe's geographers, and he was on the Polish Boundary Commission at the Paris Peace Conference. He would serve on the U.S. Council of Foreign Relations after 1921, and on the board of one of the most influential journals in American foreign policy. It's called Foreign Affairs. Bowman, too, was the head of the International Geographers Union and became the 6th president of Johns Hopkins University in 1935. He had the ear of presidents, starting with Woodrow Wilson, ending with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Bowman rejected adamantly the idea of self-determination for Ukraine. But he supported it for Poland. And he supported his friend Romer. He and Romer became close colleagues and friends, and they often exchanged across the Atlantic maps of the world between Lviv and New York in the years after World War I. Now, what can we say about Ukrainian geography? In a key respect, after World War I, Ukraine became everyone's geopolitical object. Not the subject of its own history, but a borderland between East and West, Lenin and Wilson, Catholicism and Orthodoxy, the Bolsheviks and the US and its allies, etc. Ukraine was mapped as a center of Western civilization. The US geographic experts supported national self-determination, наприклад, for a democratic Czechoslovakia and Poland, but not for Ukraine. Okay. Let's now zero in on Halichina. I employ these transnational stories to shift the camera lens of the Great War. Out of Lviv, Halichina, and Ukraine as the imagined center of the world, Globus Ukraine, or Western or European civilization. It becomes tempting for us, after Maidan, to write liberationist, future-oriented maps, Eurocentric hopes, and narratives for Ukraine's struggles. And I understand that. Sometimes it's needed. But this, I would argue, is not only because of the hopes for basic human dignity in the revolution, but more complexly because, I think, in memory wars, it's no longer critically possible, given what historians write about World War II, that is, German-Ukrainian, Polish-Ukrainian, Ukrainian-Jewish, Ukrainian-Russian relations, Ukrainian-Soviet relations, and so on. It's no longer possible to write happy narratives. And so the initial efforts at Vergangenheitsbewältigung, working through the past and post-war reconciliation, stand for us as a continuation of World War I and II. Now, let me turn to Stepan Rudnitsky, Maps of Ukraine. And notice this map in here is in, I've shown this before. It is the ethnographic survey map of Ukraine, published in German. There were editions in Ukrainian and maybe 15 or 16 other languages during World War I. Romer had been born in Lemberg, Leopold, Lviv, Lviv in 1871, Rudnitsky in Peremyshl in 1877. They quarreled over geography in the 1900s, a scientific rift that was never repaired, as disciplinary sciences, subdisciplines went in their own directions. In the Age of Empire, Rudnitsky thought by mapping Ukraine, he could avoid world war. This was his reasoning, to avoid a fraternal war. And he thought this was possible in 1914 by joining co-national Ruthenians, Little Russians, Ukrainians, as a population on both sides of the Zbruch River, from claimed Habsburg and Russian lands. Rudnitsky and Romer became national professors of geography, one Polish, one Ukrainian, although both of them spoke German, in addition to other languages. Rudnitsky, like Romer, had been a graduate student of Penck. Now, while Romer bore a lifelong chauvinism toward Ukrainians, and he classified Ruthenians or anarcho-Ruthenians generally in his works in the 19-teens, an interesting fact about Romer is that a Ukrainian married into his family. So his brother, Jan Edmund, became a general in Piłsudski's legions and was active on the outskirts of Lviv in the Polish-Ukrainian War in 1918-1919. Jan's wife and Eugeniusz's sister-in-law was a woman by the name of Stefania Litinska, a Ruthenian Greek Catholic who assimilated, in quotes, to Poland. Let's take a look at their lives, these scientific men, from gender studies. So, in the Bildung-type tradition of the late 19th century Galician intelligentsia, Rudnitsky represented the hopes and dreams of a kind of future kin state. Middle class, educated, multilingual, European, and modern. This was his Ukraine. Take, for instance, his marriage in 1902, which I think was a kind of social calculus, and I leave love questions aside. He got married in Lviv at the age of 25, and his bride, Sybilla Schenker, was just 21. She was the daughter of a retired Austro-Hungarian officer from Stri. The first of their 3 children was born in Lviv in 1902, and they named her Emilia, after Stepan's late mother, who was of Armenian descent. So now we have another interesting national moment for Ukraine. Levko, their second child, was born in 1908 and named after Stepan's father, Lev, while Irina, whom the parents called Arisia, was born in 1912. And I should mention about the children, only 2 of the children survived World War II. 2 of them disappeared somewhere around Voronezh in 1940. I'll get to that in a moment. Stepan and Sybilla, the 2 Rudnitskys, were multilingual, educated Ukrainians, activist-minded teachers who shared the drive in Galicia for education and literacy. And what's interesting also about Rudnitsky is his writings about marriage. So, for example, Rudnitsky, and some of his work was appropriated later by the OUN, discouraged intermarriage, discouraged miscegenation, thought that this would lead to the degeneration of the Ukrainian diaspora. So what we have here is a lot of gendered knowledge and silence. Before World War I, the Rudnitskys had some financial difficulties. And we can read their maps from this angle. Unlike the bourgeois marriages of Penck or Romer, and I should mention, Romer married the heiress to the Okochin brewery, Jadwiga Rosknecht. Penck married, let me get this correct, his wife was the sister of a very famous Heimat novelist in Bavaria, Ludwig von Gonghofer. Rudnitsky's case is different. The marriage in the 1900s, preceding World War I, did not automatically result in upward mobility. Sibylla, in short, absolutely had to work for a living while Rudnitsky made all of his maps. She earned money for the family as a teacher. Remember, it's expensive to make these things, right? In the village of Komanichi near Peremyshlo. She took part in welfare organizations and was domesticated as Rudnitsky's other, caring for Ruthenian children. This took a really harsh toll on her, and she's been, I think, almost entirely written out of the great man biography. She had a congenital heart condition, heart treatment, for which she required treatment in European sanatoria. And if you've read Thomas Mann at Zauberberg, for example, you know that these places are crazy and expensive. She fell constantly ill, did Sibylla. And in Galicia, the Rudnitskys could not afford specialized health care. She died in 1918, the last year of the war, at the age of 35. Now, this gender history of the modern Ukrainian body, the map, allows for a different view of knowledge and how maps create meaning. Before the Great War, at Hrushevsky's urging, Rudnitsky, along with a lot of men who worked for Entesha, gathered materials to write the first national geography of Ukraine. In 1907, the maps he made of Ukraine preceded the political territory. The activities aroused Romer's suspicions about Rudnitsky. And Romer had a pointed exchange in an obscure journal that nobody reads anymore. It was called Cosmos, modeled after Alexander von Humboldt, in which Romer denied Rudnitsky's scientific credentials, nenaučné. The confrontation between Poland and Ukraine, between Romer and Rudnitsky, foreshadowed the territorial map wars of World War I and the Polish-Ukrainian War, which followed it. Now, and just these maps which I show here briefly to mention, some of them were produced in Poland, some of them were produced in Germany. The one at the, let's see here, at the far right is actually Nazi cartography from 1937. The one at the far left was one of the maps made by Romer and his associates after 1919. The one at the bottom is actually one of Rudnitsky's maps. Okay. So the world maps of Rudnitsky and his colleagues were a form of gendered knowledge. In the 1900s, 19-teens, 1920s, and he disseminated Ukrainian geography, sometimes in propaganda style, in search of a Heimat, as Penck once had done in Vienna and Berlin. Rudnitsky worked to develop new field studies, research methods, and train national cadres. He finished his first geography of Ukraine in 1909, and the first physical geography of Ukraine was printed in Kiev by the publisher Lan in 1910. In a mysterious moment, the publisher Lan lost Rudnitsky's second manuscript. His Ukrainian work, based on German geography, just back to this for a moment, to show some of the interconnections. The publisher lost Rudnitsky's work, which was inspired by Friedrich Ratzel, the Anthropogeographie, and the idea of Lebensraum, or living space. Okay. What about Rudnitsky's influence from World War I and beyond? His influence was noticeable during and after the Great War. Well after his murder in 1937 by the NKVD. Well after World War II. Having explicitly borrowed in a transnational way so-called bourgeois geography, as the Soviets called it, from Penck and Ratzel, Rudnitsky rewrote the geography of Ukraine in full. And he printed his book about Ukrainian geography in Lviv in summer 1914, just before the Russian Imperial Army crossed into Habsburg, Galicia. Rudnitsky, I think, saw in geography for Ukraine what Hrushevsky saw in history. It was a way to train citizens and thereby unite co-national Ukrainians in the diaspora and across borders, patriotically, often, into newly settled territories. And so he produced his maps with this in mind, and people who followed in the Rudnitsky school produced their maps with that in mind. So the first school atlas of Ukraine was made in 1912. It was reprinted 1917, 1919, 1928. It followed Romer. Romer had done this in 1908. So Rudnitsky's maps and world atlases depicted Europe's great powers and carved out a territory for Ukraine, usually based on Austro-Hungarian census statistics. When World War I broke out in August of 1914, Rudnitsky left Lviv for Vienna. And there, in Vienna, working for the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine, he produced maps, pamphlets, books, and propaganda directed against Romer for the sake of Ukrainian independence. Rudnitsky, in short, became the world's leading geographer and expert on the lands and peoples in Ukraine. Thus was Rudnitsky's map war also a great war, and it was continued by people like Kubiovich. Rudnitsky's Great War for modern Ukraine was part of a set of transnational practices for Joseph Conrad's 20th century, as predicted in Heart of Darkness. He internalized colonialism and colored in all the lands. He was a student of Penck. He attended Penck's birthday, 60th birthday in Berlin in spring of 1918. He continued in the emigration to work for N.T. Shah and to correspond with Hrushevsky. Rudnitsky, tragically, unfortunately for the Ukrainian cause, lost his academic position here. He fled to Prague and Vienna. And then, in probably the most fateful decision of his life, Rudnitsky made the decision in 1925 to move to Kharkiv. There in Soviet Kharkiv, and this is covered in an extraordinary correspondence with his sister Sofia Nistranska, he worked in institutions for the building of Ukrainian geography, cartography, as science. He did this until he was arrested in 1933. Rudnitsky was charged as part of the Stalinist purges with fascism and counter-revolution. This applied to his entire family. He was executed together with many members of the Ukrainian intelligentsia at Solovki in 1937. This tragic story is a story beyond maps. And yes, it's tragic. It tempts us, as well it should, into tales of heroic science, struggle, and victimhood. This is not where I want to end the story of World War I. So now, in the most abrupt shift I can possibly think of, I'm going to take you on a tour of Thailand. Let me offer an alternative reading of Ukrainian 20th century history. In the history of the Great War beyond this supposed civilizational space, beyond Europe. Instead of national heroes, we can take our colonial knowledge elsewhere. So this is the last part of my talk, and it's a method that I developed in my Map Wars book that's coming out. I call it spatial prosopography. The geographer's maps of color and darkness can be seen in a world history context, a global context. I call this thought experiment, and forgive me because this didn't fit into the title, my Sino-Thai American Conradian Zabushkist, after Oksana Zabushko, post-colonial subaltern revisionist school of Ukrainian historiography. This seems too wordy for a lecture title. It's a view from nowhere, or more tangibly, and I hope humanely, a Buddhist view from Bangkok. I live in Southern California next to the Pacific Ocean, so I look out the window differently. I take my inspiration from Conrad and from the person you see behind me, Tongchai Winachokol, who was born in Thailand in the 1950s. So he's really my last figure, my individual life of the Great War. Thongchai Winechokal today is the most prominent historian of Thailand, a professor, a public intellectual, a former prisoner in the age of Havel and Mandela, and a non-elite, an ordinary person, a student activist, who moved from Southeast Asia to Australia to the United States to make a career in the 1980s. He came of age at a critical moment in world history with an interest in geography in the 1960s and 1970s. He operated, of course, as a Thai citizen completely outside of the Soviet orbit during the era of the rise of civil rights and feminist movements, decolonization projects in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, after all the world's spaces had been colored in. In 1988, in his classic book, Siam Mapped, he wrote the following, quote, "We all now know how, I should say, important the territoriality of a nation is." He could have been writing about Ukraine. There are innumerable concepts, practices, and institutions related to it, or working within the provision and limitation of a nation's geo-body. The concept of integrity and sovereignty, border control, armed conflict, invasions, and wars, the territorial definition of national economy, products, industries, trade, tax, custom duties, education, administration, culture, and so on. In his role as a historian and activist, Winechokal wrote finally, "But the term geo-body is used to signify that the object of this study, the history of 20th century Thailand, is not merely space or territory. It is a component of the life of a nation. It is a source of pride, loyalty, love, passion, bias, hatred, reason, unreason." Winechokal, like Conrad, made his fame in English, his third language. Siam Mapped was a masterful critique from 1988 of 20th century Thai historiography. It was a kind of Hrushevsky approach. But it was different. It significantly inspired Benedict Anderson, Imagined Communities, classic study in 1991, and the book is translated or now being translated into Chinese, Japanese, Thai, and Korean. Winechokal and Anderson were concerned with the social constructedness of nations, and he involved himself in rather risky social grassroots struggles for human rights and the growth of civil society in Thailand. Thailand, if I stretch it even further, was Winechokal's Maidan. And as an anti-imperial, anti-militarist, anti-royalist, anti-oligarchist, democratic activist in the 1970s and 1980s, he became a prisoner of conscience, forced finally from Thailand to Australia in the mid-1970s and then to the United States. So just very briefly, the history of Thailand, and you can read it someplace else if you want. Let's consider this Ukraine and Thailand together. In the 19th century, the most important thing to remember about Thailand was that through its monarchy in an imperial age, it was able to avoid European colonialism, avoid brute colonization. And this was a central myth for Thai national identity in the 20th century in a European sort of way. It was the only country before the Great War in Southeast Asia to avoid colonial rule. So it seems, in that sense, an anti-paradigm for Ukraine. In 1914 and until 1932, Thailand remained a monarchy ruled by Rama VI. We'll call him a Habsburg for the sake of argument. He was not. Who shrewdly saw Europe's Great War as an opportunity to promote Thai nationalism at every turn, while also solidifying his own power. So both European and Thai. How did he do this? Wars really helped. In his life from 1880 to 1925, Siam's king was an amateur geographer and a calculating one. He had lost the territories of Laos and Cambodia to the kingdom before the Great War. So he was nothing if not an opportunist, and Europe's great powers helped. The Thai king, or Siam king, king of Siam, hoped geopolitically to become more European while warding off Asian great powers, in particular Japan. During World War I, he pledged Thai support, as the Americans did, to Britain and France, the most powerful colonials in Southeast Asia and Indochina, and he did this in order to gain favor and recover territories. In July 1917, and remember that the Americans enter in April of 1917, during the latter stages of the Great War, Siam finally formally declares war against Germany, Austro-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and the Central Powers. Rama VI changed the flag design in 1917 of the country. New colors, mimicking Europe, becoming Europe, at least in fiction, with the hybrid of the Union Jack and the French tricolore, so the new flag. The monarch of Siam, in short, looked exaggeratedly and hopefully to the West. And he was ultimately rewarded for this at the end of the Great War. For his token participation in 1919, he was rewarded. He got a seat at the Paris Peace Conference and the League of Nations. So just to wrap up the story of Thailand, fast forward through 20th century history, and I'll try to make some sense of this. Thailand experienced its own major 20th century tragedies and events. Just to run through these very quickly: palace coups, invasion by fascist Japan, collaboration during World War II, revolution in 1973, and this directly affected Vinachakal, created a democratic student movement which lasts to this day. Thailand has experienced many military coups, one in 1976 after the communists took over South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Oligarchy in the 1980s and 1990s, anti-corruption protests which also look a lot like the color revolutions from 2001 to 2006, and on again, and on. And more coups again in 2006, another one in 2014. Why does any of this matter? Why should Ukrainians care about something beyond Polichina? Some conclusions. This use of Vinachakal and the king of Siam allows us to reconsider what Vinachakal had written about. A component of the life of a nation, a source of pride, loyalty, love, passion, bias, hatred, reason, unreason. It gives us insight into the emotions of maps. It allows us to reconsider Rudnitsky and his maps from the ground up. Modern Thai history represents a way to understand Ukraine transnationally, non-Eurocentrically, in a global perspective, and the legacy that's left to the world behind the Great War. It allows us to shift away from heroic, scientific uses of language, confession, history, and territory, away from the myths of founding great men, these men who became entrenched, sit in university chairs, and direct academic disciplines. Vinachakal offers us from the ground level post-colonial and subaltern insight into patterns of conformity and resistance. The deeply personal, interior, intimately performed, gendered spaces on our own maps. And just now to conclude, as Europe's transnational geographers who went national and who performed from Western epistemic notions, knowledge, of totalizing classificatory grids, as described by Benedict Anderson, the practices and erotics of borders, of conquest of nature, of colonial knowledge, of normative power, Romer and Rudnitsky from this very area from Lviv, had many Galician things in common. What did they have in common, these men? Well, they were geographers. They clung hard to the things that geographers use as tools. In their age, this meant biological racism or difference, gender binarism, and notions of Western civilization. They were part of an era of late 19th century and early 20th century, from the 1870s to the 1930s to the 1950s. This era of academic professionalization and specialization. So, ente sha, pao, pan, vuan, nan, and so on. The women with whom they had relations were treated with a kind of common, everyday human sympathy, but their rights were not regarded. They were seen as biological inferiors, homebound wives, sisters, and secretaries. The geographers called themselves, and were regarded by their peers, as canonical experts and scientists. They felt most comfortable among like-minded geographers who were men. Explorers like Humboldt of Europe's 19th century colonial tradition, transgressors of boundaries, disciplinary arrangers and conquerors and penetrators of the natural world. Romer and Rudnitsky from Galicia believed in education, prosvita, enlightenment, and progress. They obsessed over closed borders, open frontier spaces, and the geo-bodies that were made even before World War I, for they drew the maps before the territory. We might expect this, and expect this from an era of total war, revolution, invasion, inter-ethnic war, and civil war. Together, I think, we're the children and grandchildren of these geographers, their maps of color and darkness, and the wars after war, after World War I, which they drew with their maps. The Great War in Ukraine, which started in 1914, is not over, however much we might want it to be. Thanks.
Thank you very much for wonderful lecture. I would like to ask our participants whether they have any questions. Then I would like to be the first to ask the question. When you finished your lecture, you said the following. You said that the key moment of our understanding of the First World War is that the First World War is not over, however much we may want it to be. How do people in the world, in Thailand and in other countries, how do they feel it? What ideas, what concepts do we live through? How do we feel it? What influences us, and how is it reflected in the contemporary maps of the world and Ukraine in particular?
Yeah, I think Eva, your question is about influence and legacy and maps. So what remains with us in the sense that the war is not over? I would give two different kinds of answers to that. One is about geopolitics, and the other is about memory. First, about geopolitics. So, when in the 1890s and the 1900s, influential writers like Halford Mackinder, Rudolf Chelane, Friedrich Ratzel, used concepts like geopolitics. This is the moment in 1899 when the concept was really used, I think for the first time. they were thinking about the power of states. And they were thinking about states as organic things, right? So not just the organic nation in the sense of Johann Gottfried von Herder, but that the state with enclosed borders was to be protected and all of its resources, its natural resources exploited and utilized, and its populations mapped and classified and that sort of thing. So we get from this particular moment in World War I an aggravation of nationalist and nationalizing understandings of states. Because ultimately, what happens after World War I is the collapse of multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-confessional empires. And so, in Central and Eastern Europe, in particular, geopolitical discourses become used and instrumentalized. And probably the best example of this is Germany in the 1920s. So, if you read Karl von Haushofer, for example, you can see this. The spatial turn is not new. Geopolitical discourses were not invented by Alexander Dugin, right? They were used actually by revisionist powers after World War I. So I think one aspect of this is geopolitics. And we see this in maps, which become used as like, you know, instruments and tools to beat the enemy, right? And to advertise the need to revise borders. So that's the first part. The second part has to do with memory. One of the classic books about World War I, which I read back when I was a student, was Paul Fussel's The Great War and Modern Memory, which became a classic in the 1970s, and a really important book because Fussell used poetry, he used literature, he used culture, in order to describe the everyday experiences of total war. So the mobilization of people on the front, people at home, the mobilization of industry, the use of weapons of a chemical sort for the first time. And I think memory becomes especially important in the world of maps, because maps necessarily require an aura, like Walter Benjamin described as objects. And so they have this particular sense of authenticity. And so when maps and digital images get collected and then passed around through Twitter and Facebook and Reddit and so forth, they're often used as arguments without words. And so when one then acquires these maps and puts them on one's smartphone or in one's office or in one's sort of local and intimate spaces, one is saying something about identity, that this map matters. Culturally, politically, this space is mine, and I identify with it.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions? Good evening. I am a historian. I work in Lviv University, and within my competence I would like to say I also used the diary of Romer, and I have a question. Romer, geography in the First World War, during the First World War, was used as the way of war, as a kind of weapon. Could you say in which way the works of Romer was a weapon, and in whose hands was it a weapon, if it was a weapon? And I didn't understand much from your lecture why Pank wanted Romer to be arrested, to have Romer arrested. I didn't really get it much. Thank you.
Okay, so these are two questions. One is about Romer's diary. I'm so happy that someone has read Romer's diary. The second is about Pank and why he wanted Romer to be arrested. Romer, first of all, tells his diary in a very curious way, this pamiętnik paryski. He wants to explain why he's right about everything. So my correct view on everything, to borrow the sort of famous phrase of Leszek Kołakowski. Romer is extremely interested in defeating rival arguments, particularly in Poland. So other geographers like Wacław Malkowski, who's a liberal Warszawian. Romer is a Galician, and he actually uses Galicia to explain the rise of modern nationalism and ethnic tensions, and also to make the case for the annexation of territories of the old Rzeczpospolita, right? He also, I think, in writing the Pamiętnik Paryski, in writing the diary of Paris, a lot like Bowman, wants to emphasize how hard he was working for Poland. So literally, because the Poles were not invited, Romer showed up with his maps, his atlases. He knocked on doors in Paris. He, together with Roman Dmowski and the Polish delegation, tried very hard to charm some of the most influential geographers like Emmanuel de Marton in Paris, who was also responsible for mapping the lands after empire. Romer is also, I think, a very curious individual because he actually has a second publication, another memoir, autobiographical story, which he writes, and it's censored in communist Poland in the PRL until the late 1980s. He writes it as a Catholic convert. So he writes this as a conversion story. He finds God, in short. But he finds God at a particular moment. The moment for Romer comes after the death of his wife. So after the invasion in September of 1939, and after his wife Jadwiga dies in 1940, Romer has a change of heart. He had, it seems, been raised in a very secular home in Galicia. His father was an Austro-Hungarian civil servant. But he has this moment of religious conversion, and he actually hides right around the corner from here in the Zmartwychwstańców monastery between 1941 and 1944. So I write about this in my book. I think Romer in some ways married geography in a gendered kind of way. Like geography becomes his beruf, his profession. It also becomes, during World War II, his spouse. Like he's actually kind of working in the monastery day and night, behind walls, on making maps of Poland. So, like, he reinterprets his experiences of World War I through World War II. And Pank, this short, strange story about Pank. You know, Pank was one of these, he was probably Germany's most famous, or one of the most famous geographers before World War I. Now he's almost completely forgotten. He died in 1945 in Prague. His apartment in Berlin in 1944 was bombed out. He was 87 years old when he died in Prague. He had a daughter who married into a Czech family, which is, I think, strange because he supports both Hitler during World War II and the Kaiser during World War I. He wants to get Romer arrested on the following logic. Romer had produced the Geographical Statistical Atlas of Poland in a country with territory that was controlled and occupied by one of the Central Powers. So because Romer produced a map in Austro-Hungary, or in the Habsburg Empire, as a Pole, calling for the revision of borders, he should therefore be arrested for treason. And so what he tries to do is actually call the police, or use one of his friends to call the police in Vienna to make sure that Romer doesn't produce any more maps, because those maps would be anti-German and so on and so forth, and defeat his own great wissenschaftliche understanding of German territory in the East and around the world. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve, for putting together those two historians, those two figures that are very often treated separately. At least I knew them separately. When I was learning, they were separate. I have three questions. Which maps did they produce? Which maps were of no interest to them? That's my first question. I'm interested where you are going to lead us with this question. Second question, in prepared maps of the world in atlases, how did they depict Thailand and other places? Where did they get information how to depict Thailand and other places which were quite remote? And the third question, how did they see their audience? Did they see their audience in the number of maps, in the number of people who are going to buy their maps? Or maybe these were people who were VIP people who were using their maps? And the fourth question, in the city which had three ethnic religious groups, did they see? And were there maps in Yiddish and Hebrew? Or maps in Yiddish and Hebrew were not important? If yes, if not important, why? Thank you.
Wow, that's overwhelming. My goodness, I don't know if I have an answer for everything, but I'll try. Я попытаюсь. So, the maps that were of no interest to them, I think they were interested in everything, actually. The reason for that is because they come out of an era in which sciences move from things that are amateur to professional. And this is a very slow process, but honestly, if you study the Ente Shah in these years, and its division between sections, you know, Romer didn't have an independent geography section. The section was called the mathematical natural section of the Ente Shah. It had its separate journal, Zapiski. So, unlike in other countries in Europe where already geography was an independent discipline, you know, the geographical societies had been founded, the first was in Paris in 1821, the second was in Berlin in 1828, the third was the Royal Geographical Society in England in 1830, the fourth was in St. Petersburg, the Russian Geographical Society. Obviously, Poland and Ukraine are both stateless nations at this time, so they cannot do this. And this creates a really deep fervor for borrowing knowledge and really like acquiring everything. So when they went abroad, both of them in the 1890s and in the 1900s to Germany, Mitteleuropa was their center of everything. It was the center of learning. It was the center of Vorbildung. They met with important German and Austrian geographers. Romer made acquaintances with important publishing firms like Justus Perthes in Gotha, which became a model for the Książnica Atlas publishing house, the commercial house. So I would say all maps were interesting to them, and the same can be said about Rudnitsky, who had a lot of inspiration from Pank. Pank had some real anxiety about cartography because Romer was better at making maps than Pank. Much better in terms of graphic design, in terms of funding. Don't forget, in Germany, it's really difficult to draw maps of the eastern border. I mean, this is the Großdeutsche, Kleindeutsche debate from 1848. It continues well beyond Bismarck. It's an undefinable border where there are settlements. And so, you know, in the 1920s, when Pank produces these really famous Deutsche Volks- und Kulturboden maps, this maps of population and culture and soil. He imagines a revisionist sort of greater Germany in Poland and Ukraine and stretching all the way through Eurasia. These maps are later appropriated by Nazi science after 1933. As for the Atlas of the maps of Thailand, what I remember from these initial maps of the world that Romer and Rudnitsky produced. In fact, I just looked at one today in the Videokartografie. Rudnitsky made the first Ukrainian language maps of the two hemispheres, and this is complete colonial knowledge. Completely. So, I really hesitate when Ukrainian 20th century history is rewritten from a would-be post-colonial perspective, because often the post-colonial perspective becomes another way for introducing or reintroducing Ukrainian nationalism. Rudnitsky's constructions of colonial knowledge were borrowed from Ostmitteleuropa. They were borrowed from some of the most popular atlases, and this is how Thailand was mapped. I don't remember Thailand exactly. I don't think they respected its, sort of 19th century half myth, half truth that it had never been conquered by European powers. I'm not sure about that. As for the audience of VIP, the audience is an audience for mass mobilization and propaganda. This is phase C of Miroslav Hroch for nationalism studies. This is a moment when maps, especially during the Great War, affect perception and cognition. It's a moment when they seek to reach millions of people. So, for example, Rudnitsky's seminal history of Ukrainian geography, it's called Ukraine und der Ukrainer. He wrote it both in German and Ukrainian, Ukraine and Ukrainians, sold maybe about 2 million copies. And that's substantial, you consider the number of Ukrainians in World War I. He was trying to reach Ukrainians on both sides of the Habsburg-Russian border, and this is actually something that he intended. As for Yiddish and Hebrew maps, I get asked this question actually a lot. I just finished an article about the religious identity of Rudnitsky, which is going to be published by Harvard Ukrainian Studies. And, they didn't know Yiddish or Hebrew, and never, it seemed, bothered to have much interest. Both of their orientations, I think, were racial and ethnic, but racial means something different in different contexts. Romer, for example, during World War II, while he's in the monastery, is far from anti-Semitic, but he's extremely anti-Ukrainian. And this probably doesn't come as too much of a surprise. They never studied the languages. I think they were much more concerned with assimilation, with political diasporas, and especially in the demographic maps that they made, or ethnografichnia maps that they made, with maximizing the number of their populations. So, to minimize the population would be to, respect the integrity of a Jewish population which would not be assimilated or not be acculturated to Poland or Ukraine. Because they wanted to maximize in these population statistics arguments or population politics the number of Poles or the number of Ukrainians, it was extremely important to raise the numbers rather than to diminish them. Thanks.
I'm interested in the technology and technical side of making maps. Did they travel to see the world, or was it done in the office? And why did they do this? What arguments did they use, for example, to mark a border? Did they have any standard understanding and vision of the nation of that time, or did they use any other facts to do that, or any other ideas.
I love this question because it's about aesthetics. So these are also works of art. I mean, this is mistectvo. They, I think, first of all, had issues with money. So, you know, it's expensive to make a map, and it's expensive to make an atlas. This is the age before the internet in 1995. It's the age before GIS. You know, I mean, the internet has significantly democratized, maybe even created a techno-utopia for map making. But in the old days, really old days, by which I mean before 1914, the production of maps was a political enterprise. So in Russia, censorship existed, as you might expect. Maps were usually, even in the imperial period, not made for the public. Even the most important commercial firm, which was the Ilyin and Poltorotsky firm in the Russian Empire, founded in 1859, had to pass through a series of kind of preliminary censors to get maps of the Russian Empire out. The Ilyin family considered Russian language maps to be almost like ikoni. They wanted their maps to literally, and this is in the catalog from 1889, to hang in every single corner of the Russian Empire. And so they listed then all of the major cities where maps in the Russian language should be produced. And remember the language politics of Imperial Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, Malaruski, and so forth, Ukrainian in this period. The technology, I think, begins with the money question. So where does the money come from? The money for the Ilyins generally came from the Russian government. And it's really important to have a state when you want to produce maps. If you don't have a state, or sorry, if you have a completely dysfunctional state, then you have to look for other alternatives. Romer was really good at this. Like, I think it's a lesson for the Ukrainians. What Romer did was to find extremely rich, supportive people, especially in Vienna, who could finance and fund the maps, and finance and fund the Geographical Statistical Atlas. And this is exactly what Penck accused him of, right? That he was a man without a state, and that he was, he had no authority, no right, no scientific right to make maps. As for Rudnitsky, I think he had even less available opportunity and funds. So, I mean, he had to rely on his scientific connections. If you look in the city archive here in Lviv, he has an extended correspondence with Freitag und Berndt, and he tries to produce really nice graphic images of maps through Freitag und Berndt. The problem, of course, is that, unfortunately, in November of 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, and so he's really no longer able, after 1918, to have political support. He has to rely on the immigration. He goes to Prague, goes to Vienna, and then, in 1925, he goes to Kharkiv. And I think this moment is neglected, because why would someone choose the Soviet Union after all of this experience? I think he chooses it because of his experience vis-a-vis Poland. And I think he actually believes, as a geographer and a cartographer and someone who's used the technical aspects or experienced what it means to be in a lab producing maps, he wants to reinvent this and recreate this. And he wants the affirmative action campaign for Ukrainians in the Soviet Union to work. He just chooses the wrong time. So, you know, he goes to this institute in Kharkiv with other members of the Ukrainian technical intelligentsia in the 1920s, and he quickly finds out the ideological basis of Soviet power, and that he's simply not able to produce in a Marxist universe or or in an ideological universe which he cannot control, political maps of Ukraine. He can't do it. So the irony of this is that Rudnitsky gets the technical means, but he doesn't have the political support. Romer, on the other hand, lacks the economic support. He has to go through other channels in order to get it, especially in the first years of the Druga Rzeczpospolita, of the Second Republic. But, you know, they have completely different circumstances as they follow this trajectory through the 1920s and 1930s. It's a really great question. Thanks.
I have the following question. During the First World War, who made topographic maps for military objects? And the second question. In the period of West Ukrainian People's Republic, maps were made in Lviv. Were maps made in Lviv? That's the question. And the third question. Who were the consultants on Kherson Line?
Okay, three questions briefly. The topographic maps were generally produced by engineers. They were made by military topographical corps, so Army Corps of Engineers. This is a legacy both of the Habsburg and Russian empires. The maps were in versts in the Russian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was especially good at making 1 to 75,000 maps. These were generally made within the war ministries of both the Russian Empire and the Habsburg Empire. So that's a good question. Were maps made in Lviv? The most important firm for producing maps in interwar Lviv, Lemberg, I'll call it Lviv, was Książnica Atlas. This was Romer's cartographic firm. Romer worked really after he had come back from Paris in June of 1919 with this firm in his home city. The maps that he produced were in Polish. They were intended for Polish school books, for children, for educational projects. He eventually founded a kind of second Książnica Atlas in Warsaw. But he experienced a lot of problems, did Romer, and believe me, I'm not defending Romer, especially not in Ukraine, but some things that Romer did were, I think, really fascinating. Like, for instance, he tried between 1919 and 1926 to keep maps in the hands of civilians rather than in the hands of the military. So this belief in społeczeństwo or suspilstvo, he believed in a civil society, and he was very worried and very skeptical about Pilsudski. And it turned out that he was right in 1926 with the Pilsudski coup. He actually has a number of exchanges where he does not want, as he calls it, the Russian model, in which the military controls everything, in which the military controls mapping. He thinks that it has to be in civilian hands. So yes, maps were made in Lviv. They were mostly Polish. Romer was mostly behind them. They were made by Książnica Atlas. And, you know, I think as consultants, I'm sorry, I didn't get the last question. What was the third question? Oh, Curzon line. Okay. So the Curzon line, which becomes extremely important for the Polish-Soviet boundary, the Curzon line is largely imposed. So Romer is not in support of it, at least not initially. And when Romer produces first the maps for Paris and then the maps for Riga, it probably comes as no surprise that he wants Poland to be as large and as big as possible. So he rejects the idea of having bold lines which restrict Polish power, and he sees Ukraine, I think, still as most Poles see Ukraine during the interwar period, as a colonial space, where the boundaries are there. Like I use this idea of thick lines and dotted lines. I think he still sees these areas as dotted lines rather than thick, bold lines. But of course, the Treaty of Riga is really meaningful because it halts Soviet advancement, at least temporarily, in Europe in 1921. And then in 1922, when the USSR is founded, I think these borders are still with us today, even in the Maidan or post-Maidan era, where, you know, suddenly the great powers, the victors of World War I, say, all right, you know, here's a Soviet space, here's a Russian space, this is a sphere of influence, this can be under the orbit or under the control of Moscow. Romer was really not in support of that, but he was not overtly colonial to the point where there were these Promethean projects, the Pilsudski projects, in the 1920s to liberate all of the captive peoples of the Soviet republics. He was not interested in that. He was more interested in protecting Lviv. Thanks.
Дякую.
You draw a parallel between, or you try to relate Pank, Kubiovich, and Rudnitsky. Do you think that was a kind of school, or these were three different individuals?
I think there were three different individuals, and their own mental maps, mentalne karty, have to be respected. They're not all the same. Let me just take Kubiovich. You know, Kubiovich is a very curious case. I'm writing about him now. And, you know, his involvement with SS Galitzin is something that the diaspora is really not comfortable talking about, at least sometimes not comfortable talking about. But the fact was that he was born in 1900, died in 1985, born 1900, died 1985. He became trained as a geographer, and, you know, he was largely under the inspiration, for better or worse, of a kind of anthropocentric geography, human geography as it's now called, which believed in biological racism. So the thing that Romer and Kubiovich and Pank have in common is that there is a natural division of difference, there is a natural order to races and nationalities and ethnicities. Kubiovich, it seems, believed in this, and, you know, when he produced his 1937 atlas, it drew inspiration from European colonial knowledge. These currents were not criticized, attacked, revised, I would say, until at least the 1960s, 1970s, the rise of post-colonial criticism, Edward Said's work on culture and imperialism in 1978. So they were part of a particular paradigm. They were part of a particular epistemology. And one has to read their maps and their atlases in that particular way. Thanks.
That was the last question. Thank you very much. You are great. We are welcoming you in the center again, and those who want to deepen their knowledge and try themselves in cartography, maps, and borders, we have a book by Seegel, Map of Europe's Mapping Europe's Borderlands, so you can borrow this book from our library. And I would like to say a few words about our follow-up lectures. So traditionally it will be Thursday, the last Thursday of the month, the same time, 6:30 in the evening. We have a lecture on military and gender history, and also we have invited a photo artist from Great Britain who will be talking about the problems of documentation and visual representation of conflict, of the First World War and the wars that are going on in the world right now. Stephen, thank you very much, and we are welcoming everybody to join us again.